The smell of rosemary roasted chicken filled the kitchen as I carefully removed the heavy baking sheet from the oven. Sunday family dinners had become a sacred tradition after Arthur's funeral, the only way to maintain family ties that were becoming increasingly fragile and strained with each passing month. Roger and Cynthia came faithfully every week, as if fulfilling some unpleasant but necessary duty, and each time I noticed them exchanging meaningful glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Those glances spoke louder than any words. "Mom, let me help you," Roger said, getting up from his seat and reaching for the heavy dish. But I was already setting it on the table, managing without any help. "I'm not so frail that I can't carry the chicken to the table." Cynthia adjusted her perfectly styled blonde hair and slowly scanned my spacious dining room with an appraising glance. Her thin lips tightened slightly, her usual reaction to my interior, which she invariably considered hopelessly outdated and out of step with current trends. The massive antique mahogany sideboard that I had inherited from my grandmother back in the 50s, the antique oak table where Arthur and I had spent thousands of quiet family evenings discussing the events of the day and making plans for the future. All of this clearly irritated my sister-in-law with its solidity and its reminder of a time when things were made to last. "Joshua is already 20 minutes late," Roger remarked, glancing pointedly at his wristwatch. "He has university business, important meetings," came a familiar voice from the doorway. My 19-year-old grandson strode into the dining room, nodded casually in my direction instead of saying hello, and unceremoniously plopped down in his usual chair across from me. Worn jeans with deliberate holes in the knees, a crumpled t-shirt with some untidy band print, his outfit was clearly not intended for a family dinner and demonstrated complete disregard for family traditions. But I remained silent, as I had been for many months, watching my grandson gradually turn into a stranger to me. "How are things at university, Joshua?" I asked, carefully pouring fragrant chicken soup into the porcelain bowls I had inherited from my mother. "Everything's fine, Grandma." Joshua didn't even look up from his smartphone, continuing to type something quickly on the screen. "Joshua, put that thing away during family dinner." Roger scolded him rather gently, but without any particular parental sternness in his voice. My grandson rolled his eyes dramatically, as if he had been asked to perform an incredible feat, and reluctantly put his expensive phone in his jeans pocket. We began to eat in relative silence, broken only by the melodic clink of silverware against delicate porcelain and Roger's cautious attempts to strike up a casual conversation about the changeable California weather and the latest news. Cynthia delicately picked at her food, clearly trying to eat as little as possible. She was the type of woman who fanatically counted every calorie and prided herself on wearing the same size clothes she had worn at 18. "Mom, we really need to have a serious talk with you," Roger finally said solemnly when we got to the main course. I felt my shoulders tense instantly and an unpleasant chill in my stomach. I knew that particular tone well, the businesslike, decisive, slightly patronizing tone of someone who is about to deliver extremely unpleasant news, carefully packaged under the guise of sincere concern and love. "What exactly?" I asked as calmly as possible, continuing to methodically cut the tender chicken meat. "About your future, Mom." Cynthia leaned forward, feigning deep concern and maternal care. "Roger is very worried about you. We are all worried and thinking about what will happen to you next." "This house is too big and spacious for one person," my son chimed in, avoiding direct eye contact. "You're here all alone day after day. What if something serious happens? What if you fall and break your leg and no one hears your cries for help? What if you have a heart attack?" I slowly placed the silver knife and fork on the edge of my plate and looked intently at the three of them. Roger stubbornly avoided my gaze, studying the pattern on the tablecloth, while Cynthia, on the contrary, looked me straight in the eye with an expression of sincere concern that she had probably practiced for a long time in front of the mirror in her bedroom. Joshua fiddled with his phone, clearly dreaming of burying himself in it again. And what do you suggest as a solution to this problem? There are some really great places, Mom, Cynthia said even more quickly, as if afraid that I would interrupt her abruptly and not let her finish. Modern, comfortable, with excellent conditions. They have 24-hour qualified medical care, a variety of organized leisure activities, lots of people your age and with your interests. Nursing homes, I said calmly. They're not nursing homes, Mom, Roger said, finally looking up at me with genuine indignation. They're modern residential complexes for active seniors. They have gyms, extensive libraries, even theater studios and art workshops. People there don't just live out their days, they live full lives. And such wonderful places are not cheap, I suppose, I added, watching their reaction. Cynthia froze mid-sentence, not finishing her latest praise of the advantages of communal living. Roger shifted awkwardly in his chair, clearly feeling uncomfortable. Well, yes, of course. A really good place with quality service can't be cheap, he muttered, looking at his hands. But this house, Mom, it's worth a fortune now. Real estate in our neighborhood has increased in value several times over in recent years. If we sell it, here it comes, I thought. This is what they've been leading up to all this time. I always knew that sooner or later we would have this conversation. My spacious house in one of the best neighborhoods in San Jose was indeed very expensive, and I could clearly see how Cynthia looked at it appraisingly and greedily every time they came for family dinners. And the money from the sale will more than cover the cost of this wonderful place, with a decent amount left over for the family, right? I asked, looking my sister-in-law straight in the eye. Mom, what are you talking about? Roger tried to feign sincere indignation at such suspicions. It's not about the money at all. It's exclusively about your safety, your comfort, and your peace of mind. We just want to be sure that you'll be all right. At my age, real comfort is a familiar environment, I said firmly. My things, my memories, my garden, which I've been growing for 20 years. Grandma, you're really out of touch with modern life, Joshua suddenly said, looking up from his phone. Things are completely different now. Normal old people live in special places where they are professionally cared for and where they don't get in the way of young people. It's absolutely natural and right. I slowly turned to my grandson and looked at him intently. He didn't even realize how cruel and heartless his words were. To him, I was just a frail old woman, an unnecessary burden that should be put somewhere decent so that she wouldn't interfere with young people living their bright and interesting lives. Old people, I repeated slowly, savoring each syllable, a very interesting definition. Joshua didn't mean that at all. Roger hastily interjected, glaring at his son. He just expressed himself poorly. He meant exactly what he said. I calmly stopped my son. That I'm old, backward, and should get out of the way of the younger generation as soon as possible. A heavy, awkward silence hung in the dining room. Cynthia nervously twirled her wedding ring on her finger, not knowing where to look. Roger studied the ornate pattern on my antique tablecloth intently. Joshua reached for his phone again, but caught my eye and changed his mind. Mom, you're misunderstanding and twisting our words, Roger finally said, trying to take control of the situation. We just sincerely want you to be happy and at peace. We don't want you to worry about trivial things and want you to be able to enjoy life. And so that you don't have to constantly worry about me and waste your precious time on it, I added calmly. And honestly, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, Cynthia suddenly snapped, apparently deciding that diplomacy was getting us nowhere. We have our own lives, our own serious problems and concerns. Roger has to work 2 jobs to pay for Joshua's expensive university education. We have a heavy mortgage that we have to pay off for another 10 years. Cynthia, my son said warningly and rather sharply, but it was too late. What, Cynthia? I turned to my daughter-in-law and looked her straight in the eye. Please finish what you were saying. You have a heavy mortgage, and you really need the money from the sale of my house to pay it off early and ease your financial situation? Cynthia's face instantly flushed with embarrassment and anger, but she stubbornly lifted her chin, determined to see it through. What's so terrible about that? She blurted out. We're family, after all. Families should help each other in difficult times. They do, I agreed slowly, continuing to look at her. But they don't force you to sell your house and move to a completely unfamiliar place against your will. For God's sake, Mom, Roger finally exploded, losing the last of his patience. Be realistic. You live solely on the late Arthur's pension and some pitiful crumbs from an old savings account. How are you going to continue to maintain this huge house? Property taxes, ever-increasing utilities, inevitable repairs. How do you plan to pay for all this in the future? I slowly sipped cool water from a crystal glass and looked at my son for a long time. My only child, whom I had raised with love and care, on whom I had spent all my strength, time, and energy, sat across from me at the family table and coldly calculated the approximate cost of my future upkeep. I'll deal with these problems somehow, I said as quietly as possible. Mom, be reasonable. Roger leaned toward me across the table, trying to make his voice sound convincing. You're not getting any younger. What if you get seriously ill? What if you need expensive treatment or complicated surgery? How will you pay for all that? I may die long before I get seriously ill, I said calmly, even with a slight smile. Then you won't have any problems or worries at all. Mom, Roger gasped. What, Mom? I shrugged. That's exactly what you're thinking. All 3 of you, every day. When will that tiresome old hag finally pass away and free up such a valuable house for sale? Joshua snorted softly, either out of embarrassment or poorly concealed laughter. Cynthia gasped indignantly and theatrically, pressing her hand to her heart. Roger shook his graying head wearily. You're being completely unfair to us, Mom, he said reproachfully. We love you sincerely and just want you to be completely safe. Safe and at the same time far away from you, I clarified calmly. I resolutely got up from the table and began to methodically clear away the dirty plates, neatly stacking them. The family dinner was clearly coming to its logical end, even though homemade apple pie was still waiting patiently for us in the kitchen. But I no longer wanted to continue this unpleasant meal and pretend to be a happy family. Mom, stay a little longer, Roger asked, trying to keep the situation under control. Let's discuss this calmly and without emotion, like adults. I think you've already decided everything without my participation, I replied, continuing to clear the table. All that's left is to convince me to sign the necessary papers for the sale. No one decided anything without you, Cynthia exclaimed indignantly. We're just discussing possible options for your future as a family. Options for my forced eviction from my own home, I corrected, heading to the kitchen with a heavy stack of plates. When I returned to the dining room for the remaining dishes, they sat in complete silence, clearly unsure how to continue this unpleasant conversation. Roger was thoughtfully leafing through some colorful papers, apparently pre-prepared advertising brochures about various nursing homes with bright photos of happy elderly people. Cynthia was intently examining her flawless manicure. Joshua was again typing long messages to someone, completely immersed in the virtual world. "We're going home, Mom," Roger finally said when I picked up the last of the dishes. "But please, think seriously about what we said, okay? We really care about you and only want the best for you." I nodded silently, without turning to face them. I heard them slowly getting ready to leave, the melodic shuffling of chairs being pulled back, the rustling of clothes, muffled conversations in the hallway. The front door slammed quietly, and the familiar sound of a car engine starting up could be heard in the yard. I was left completely alone in my big house, which my family had been so eager to sell. The house where I had spent the best and happiest years of my long life, where I had been truly happy with my beloved Arthur, where I had raised little Roger with such trepidation and care. The house that was now officially considered an unnecessary burden. But they knew very little about me and my real life. In the morning, I woke up with a clear head and a firm decision. Yesterday's conversation with my family left a bad taste in my mouth, but at the same time reminded me of who I really am. While they considered me a helpless old woman living on a modest pension, I owned a thriving business that they didn't even suspect. I ate a leisurely breakfast, chose a strict dark blue suit, and headed into town. The drive to San Jose took about 40 minutes. I preferred to drive on familiar streets rather than the busy highway. I felt more confident behind the wheel of my reliable sedan than I had at yesterday's family dinner table. The Olive Garden restaurant was located in the heart of the business district, in a beautiful two-story building with large windows and an elegant natural stone facade. I bought this place 8 years ago when the previous owner decided to sell the business and move to another state. At that time, it was a small family restaurant with mediocre cuisine and modest income. Now, Olive Garden was considered one of the best establishments in the city, and tables here were booked a week in advance. I parked in my usual spot behind the building and walked through the service entrance. The hallway smelled of fresh herbs and garlic. The chefs were already preparing sauces for today's menu. Several employees greeted me with respectful warmth, but without fuss. Everyone knew that I didn't like unnecessary attention and preferred that my presence not disrupt the normal rhythm of work. The director's office was on the second floor, in a small but cozy room overlooking the courtyard. Thomas Miller had been working in my restaurants for 5 years and had proven himself to be an honest and competent manager. A tall, fit man in his 40s, with graying temples and attentive gray eyes, he knew how to strike a balance between friendliness and professional distance. "Ms. Clark, punctual as always." Thomas rose from the table and shook my hand. "Coffee?" "Thank you, I'd love some." He poured aromatic coffee into 2 porcelain cups and pushed a folder of documents toward me. Monthly reports, financial statements, plans for the next quarter. Everything was laid out in order and accompanied by his comments. Revenue for last month increased by 12% compared to the same period last year. Thomas began, opening the first page. "The weekends are doing particularly well. Friday and Saturday evenings are booked until the end of the month." I studied the figures carefully, asking clarifying questions from time to time. Arthur always said that a successful business requires constant attention to detail. You can't just make a profit and spend it. You need to understand where the money comes from and why customers choose your establishment. "How are things going with the new chef?" I asked, leafing through the kitchen report. "Carlos has fit in perfectly with the team." Thomas smiled. "Customers love his signature truffle ravioli. We've added it to the regular menu, and now it's one of our most popular dishes." "What about complaints?" "There were only 2 in a month, and both were minor. One lady was unhappy with the temperature of the wine, and another didn't like the lighting at her table. Everything was resolved on the spot, and no compensation was required. We discussed plans for the upcoming holidays, new items on the wine list, and minor renovations in one of the dining rooms. Thomas worked methodically and thoroughly, and I could see that the restaurant was in good hands. When we finished with the main issues, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me with slight curiosity. If it's not a secret, how are things at home? I haven't seen you so pensive in a long time. I took a sip of coffee, wondering whether to share yesterday's experiences. Thomas was not just a hired manager. Over the years, we had developed a trusting relationship, and I valued his opinion. Yesterday, my son and daughter-in-law brought up the subject of a nursing home again. I finally said, "They think it's time for me to vacate the house so it can be sold." Thomas frowned. "Do they know about the restaurants?" "They have no idea. To them, I'm just an elderly woman on a pension who can't support herself." "And you're not going to enlighten them?" I thought about it. This question had been tormenting me for several months. On the one hand, the truth could change their attitude toward me. On the other hand, did I want them to treat me well just because of the money? "Not yet," I replied. "I want to understand what kind of people they are when they think I'm defenseless. And what are your conclusions?" "Not encouraging." Thomas nodded understandingly. He was divorced himself and knew how painful the indifference of loved ones could be. "You know what I'll tell you?" He leaned forward. "You look great for your age and are clearly full of energy. All this talk about nursing homes is nonsense." "Thank you for the compliment," I smiled. "But it's not just about appearance. The thing is, they see me as a burden. Then maybe it's time to show them who you really are." We talked a little more about current affairs, and I got ready to leave. At the door, Thomas suddenly stopped me. "Ms. Clark, I have a suggestion. Why don't you stay for dinner tonight? Sit in the dining room and see how your restaurant works in the evening. It's been a long time since you've done that." I thought about it. Indeed, the last time I had dinner at my own restaurant was over a year ago. I usually limited myself to business meetings in my office and occasionally popped into the kitchen to check the quality of the food. "That's not a bad idea," I agreed. "Reserve a table for me for 8 o'clock tonight." "The best table in the house," Thomas promised. "You'll see the restaurant through the eyes of a customer." I went downstairs and walked through the main hall, assessing the situation. During the day, it was quiet and spacious here. Only a few waiters were working, setting the tables and checking the flowers in the vases. The interior was well done. Warm, sandy tones, soft lighting, live plants in pots. Nothing pretentious, but tasteful and dignified. In the evening, this place would be transformed. Candles would be lit on the tables, soft music would play, and the hall would fill with the voices of satisfied visitors. My restaurant, my brainchild, which I created and raised practically from scratch. I went outside and took a deep breath of fresh air. There were a few hours left before evening, which I could spend walking around the city or doing a little shopping, and then I would return here, not as the owner, but as an ordinary visitor, and look at my creation from the outside. My family considered me weak and dependent. Tonight, I would remind myself who I really was. By 8 o'clock, I was back at Olive Garden and immediately sensed how the atmosphere of the place had changed. The daytime business quiet had been replaced by a lively hum of voices, the soft clinking of glasses, and quiet jazz music, which created the perfect backdrop for a leisurely dinner. The hall was about 3/4 full, an excellent indicator for a Monday. The evening lighting transformed the interior, adding warmth and coziness to the sandy tones of the walls and the dark wood of the furniture. Roberto, the maître d', an elegant middle-aged man with impeccable manners, greeted me at the entrance with a special courtesy that did not seem artificial. His gray hair was neatly combed back. His snow-white shirt was impeccably ironed, and his movements had the effortless grace that only comes with years of experience in the restaurant business. "Welcome, Ms. Clark," he said quietly, leading me through the hall. "Mr. Miller has prepared the best table for you." The table was indeed excellent. in a cozy corner of the room, against a wall decorated with antique engravings of Tuscany. From here, I had an excellent view of the entire restaurant, allowing me to observe both the staff at work and the behavior of the guests. But at the same time, I remained sufficiently out of the way so as not to attract unnecessary attention. The soft armchair with a high back was upholstered in beige leather, and the table was covered with a pristine white tablecloth made of fine Irish linen. Roberto gallantly pulled out a chair, and I sat down at the table, feeling a pleasant sense of coming home. Here, in my own restaurant, I felt more confident and relaxed than anywhere else. "I'm here as a regular customer today," I warned the maitre d'. "No special attention, please. I want to see how the restaurant works from a customer's point of view." "Of course, Mrs. Clark, but allow me to offer you our best wine, a white from Napa Valley, which pairs beautifully with today's dishes." I agreed, and Roberto left, leaving me alone with the evening atmosphere of the restaurant. I slowly looked around, noting details that were not so noticeable during the day. The soft light from the wall sconces created an intimate atmosphere without making the room too dark. Candles burned in elegant glass holders on each table, casting dancing shadows on the white tablecloths. Fresh flowers in small vases added color without overwhelming the space. A few minutes later, a waitress approached me. A young woman of about 25 with chestnut hair pulled back into a neat bun and a friendly but professional smile. Her movements had the confidence of an experienced worker, and her eyes showed a sincere willingness to help. "Good evening. My name is Melissa, and I will be serving you today," she said, handing me an elegant menu in a dark green leather binding with gold embossing. "Would you like me to tell you about our signature dishes or recommend something from the wine list?" I slowly studied the menu, even though I knew it almost by heart. Thomas and the chef regularly updated the menu, keeping track of seasonal ingredients and the preferences of regular customers. The current menu successfully combined time-tested classic Italian recipes with modern presentation and several signature dishes from our new chef Carlos, whom Thomas spoke so highly of. "What would you recommend from the main courses?" I asked Melissa, deciding to test how well the staff knew the menu and how well they could present the dishes. "Today, the sea fish with risotto and white mushrooms is particularly good," the girl replied with sincere enthusiasm, and I immediately realized that she had actually tried this dish and hadn't just memorized the description. Chef Carlos prepares the fish according to a special Mediterranean recipe with herbs and lemon. The risotto is incredibly creamy, and we get the mushrooms from local suppliers who pick them in the forests of Sonoma County. I also highly recommend the truffle ravioli. It's our signature dish, and many guests come here just for it. Melissa spoke with such enthusiasm that I had no doubts about the quality of the recommended dishes. This was exactly what I wanted from the staff, not a mechanical memorization of descriptions, but a sincere belief in what they were offering. And what wine would go well with fish? I continued my testing. Our white from Napa Valley would be perfect. It has floral notes and a light minerality that won't overpower the taste of the fish. Or, if you prefer something more full-bodied, we have an excellent white from Tuscany with hints of ripe fruit. I ordered the fish and the Napa wine, and Melissa left for the kitchen, leaving me alone. Left alone, I leaned back in my comfortable chair and began to observe the life of my restaurant, deriving particular pleasure from it. A young couple sat at a table by the window. Judging by their excited faces and the way the girl kept glancing at her left hand, where a new ring sparkled, they had just gotten engaged. The young man nervously adjusted his tie and was clearly more excited than his companion, probably still not believing that she had agreed to be his wife. They held hands across the table and whispered to each other, making plans for the future. A group of 6 middle-aged business people sat at a large round table in the center of the room. Their suits, expensive watches, and confident gestures made it clear that they were serious businessmen discussing some major deal. They studied documents between courses, but did so unobtrusively, mindful that they were in a restaurant and not an office. In the opposite corner of the room, an elderly lady in her 70s was dining in proud solitude, leisurely turning the pages of a leather-bound book. She was dressed with impeccable taste in an elegant dark blue suit with pearl embellishments, and her gray hair was neatly styled. From time to time, she looked up from her book to take a sip of wine or eat a bite of salad, but she did so as if she were savoring every moment of the evening. Next to her at a table for four sat a family with a 15-year-old teenager who clearly would have preferred to be anywhere but at a family dinner. He politely kept up the conversation with his parents, but his gaze constantly wandered around the room and his fingers drummed nervously on the table. His parents, a man of about 45 in an expensive gray suit and a woman slightly younger in an elegant black dress, tried to engage their son in conversation, but it was clear that the generation gap was making itself felt. Melissa brought a glass of white wine and a basket of fresh bread, accompanied by a small bowl of golden olive oil and rosemary. The wine was excellent, light and refreshing, with subtle floral notes and a barely perceptible acidity that perfectly complemented the anticipation of dinner. The bread was still warm, with a crisp golden crust and a soft, fragrant crumb, and the olive oil had that rich, slightly spicy flavor that we had specifically sought out from a small family farm in Sonoma. I took a slow sip of wine and began to observe the staff at work, noting every detail. The waiters moved around the room with ease and silence, like dancers who knew every step of their dance. They appeared next to the guests at exactly the right moment to refill wine glasses, clear empty plates, bring the next course, and then disappeared immediately without disturbing the intimacy of the conversation at the tables. A young waiter named David, whom I remembered from previous visits, was serving a family with a teenager. I watched as he skillfully found common ground with the sullen boy, asking him about school and his hobbies, gradually thawing the icy atmosphere at the table. By the end of the main course, the teenager was laughing at the waiter's jokes and even telling his parents something himself. Bartender Alex, a tall guy with tattoos on his forearms that he carefully hid under the sleeves of his white shirt, prepared cocktails with the artistry of a true professional. His movements were precise and beautiful, and the result invariably impressed even the most discerning customers. Now he was preparing some kind of complex cocktail for a business group, juggling the shaker and bottles with such skill that even serious businessmen were distracted from their documents for a few minutes to watch the show. At one point, Thomas appeared in the hall. I saw his tall figure at the kitchen entrance. He stood there, watching the hall closely, ready to intervene at any moment if something went wrong. His gaze slid from table to table, assessing the mood of the guests, the speed of service, and the overall atmosphere. Noticing my gaze, he nodded slightly and disappeared between the tables, continuing his evening rounds. When Melissa brought the main course, I understood why Thomas had praised the new chef so highly. The fish was cooked to perfection, juicy and tender on the inside, with a golden crust on the outside that crunched under the knife, releasing fragrant juices. The risotto had the perfect creamy consistency, not too runny and not too thick, with every grain of rice cooked al dente. The white mushrooms added an exquisite forest aroma and a pleasant textural interplay to the dish, while the light lemon sauce tied all the flavors together without overpowering any of them. I ate slowly, savoring every bite and enjoying not only the excellent food, but also the atmosphere of the restaurant itself. Around me, life was bustling at a measured, calm pace. People were chatting, laughing, sharing the news of the day, and making plans for the future. Some were celebrating an important event, like the young couple by the window. Some were simply spending the evening with loved ones, and some were discussing business matters in an informal setting. And they all chose my restaurant for their important moments, entrusting me with their evenings, their celebrations, their meetings. During my time here, I noticed a few small things that were worth discussing with Thomas. One of the young waiters, a newcomer whom I didn't know by sight, took a little too long to clear a table that had just been vacated, which meant that the next guests had to sit in the waiting area at the bar for a few minutes. It was nothing critical, but such small things could accumulate and ultimately affect the overall impression of the establishment. The air conditioner on the left side of the room was working a little too intensely. I noticed an elderly lady shiver and ask David to bring her a light shawl from the cloakroom. Again, a small thing, but the comfort of guests is made up of such details. Otherwise, everything went flawlessly. The kitchen ran like clockwork. The dishes were served on time, hot and beautifully presented. The waiters were attentive but not intrusive. The bartender kept up with the orders, despite it being a fairly busy evening. Even the music was perfectly chosen, loud enough to create atmosphere, but not so loud as to interfere with conversation. When Melissa came over to ask if I wanted dessert, I ordered tiramisu and espresso. The dessert arrived fairly quickly and was beyond praise, light and airy, with a perfect balance of coffee, mascarpone, and cocoa. Each layer was soaked just enough to maintain its structure while creating a harmonious flavor. The espresso was served in a warm cup with a small cookie and a piece of dark chocolate. I ate every last crumb of the dessert, even though I don't usually have a sweet tooth, especially in the evening. But the pleasure of a perfectly prepared dish was stronger than my habits. Time imperceptibly approached 9:30. The mood in the hall gradually changed. Many visitors were moving on to the final stage of dinner, ordering coffee and digestives. Conversations became more leisurely and intimate, and the lighting was dimmed slightly, creating an even more cozy atmosphere. The business group in the center of the room had finished discussing documents and was now simply enjoying each other's company, sharing stories and anecdotes. The young couple by the window were still holding hands and planning their wedding, occasionally making me feel a little nostalgic for my own youth. The elderly lady had finished her book and was now just sitting there, sipping her after-dinner port and watching the restaurant's activities with the same interest as me. The family with the teenager was already paying the bill. The boy, completely thawed thanks to David's efforts, was now animatedly telling his parents something, and they listened to him with pleasure and pride. Sometimes one successful evening can change family relationships for the better. I finished my espresso and leaned back in my chair, continuing to watch my brainchild. Each table told its own story. Each guest got what they came for, whether it was a business meeting, a romantic dinner, family time, or just good food in a pleasant atmosphere. Yesterday, at the family table, they tried to convince me that I was a frail old woman, incapable of taking care of myself. And tonight, I was sitting in my own thriving restaurant, watching the fruits of my labor and investment. The contrast was striking and made me think about many things. My phone vibrated quietly. A message from Roger. "Mom, how are you? We hope you'll think about our conversation." I read the message and put my phone back in my purse without replying. I did have something to think about, but not in the direction my son was hoping. Around 9:30, as I was slowly finishing my second glass of wine and wondering whether to order dessert, the restaurant door swung open, letting in the cool evening air and a noisy group of young people. Their loud voices and laughter instantly attracted the attention of the entire room, disrupting the peaceful atmosphere of the evening dinner. The first to enter was a tall blonde guy in an expensive jacket, followed by a beautiful girl with long dark hair and flawless makeup. dressed as if she were going to a social event rather than a restaurant. Behind them was another couple, and bringing up the rear. My heart skipped a beat. Bringing up the rear was my grandson Joshua, dressed much more elegantly than usual, in dark jeans without holes and a light-colored shirt. He was talking animatedly to his companions, gesturing with his hands and clearly trying to impress them. Roberto hurried toward them with a professional smile, but I could see a slight concern in his eyes. He sensed that this group might disturb the peace of the establishment. "Welcome to Olive Garden," he said with dignity. "Do you have a reservation?" "Of course we do," replied the blonde-haired guy, clearly the leader of the group, under the name Preston, for 6 at 9:30. Roberto checked the list and nodded. "Certainly, Mr. Preston. Please follow me." I instinctively moved back a little in my chair, hoping to remain unnoticed. My table was in the corner, and with the soft lighting in the restaurant, there was little chance that Joshua would see me. But fate had other plans. Roberto led the group across the room to a large table against the opposite wall, and Joshua, looking around and clearly wanting to show his friends that he was not here for the first time, accidentally glanced in my direction. His face instantly paled, his eyes widened in horror, and his mouth opened in silent amazement. "What's wrong, Josh?" asked the dark-haired girl, noticing his pause. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Nothing. I'm fine," Joshua muttered. But he continued to look at me with the expression of someone who had just discovered a bomb under his chair. The group sat down at the table, but my grandson clearly couldn't concentrate on the conversation. He kept glancing nervously in my direction, clearly hoping I would disappear on my own. His friends ordered wine and studied the menu, while he sat on pins and needles. The dark-haired girl, who was apparently the object of his romantic interest, was saying something to him, but Joshua was responding inappropriately, constantly distracted. Finally, when the waiter brought them water and bread, my grandson's nerves gave way. "Excuse me, I'll be right back," he said, abruptly getting up from the table. "Where are you going?" the girl asked in surprise. "To the restroom," Joshua muttered, and headed straight for me. I pretended to study the wine list, but I saw him approaching with quick, nervous steps. His face expressed both panic and despair. "Grandma," he whispered as he approached my table, "what are you doing here?" "Having dinner," I replied calmly, without looking up from the menu. "And you?" I, we, "It's important." He glanced nervously at his friends. "Grandma, you need to leave." "Excuse me?" "Please." His voice took on a pleading tone. "I'm here with my friends from university. It's a very important meeting. You can have dinner any other time." I finally looked up at him and saw real fear in his eyes. My grandson was afraid that I would embarrass him in front of his friends, that his grandmother, an old woman in a strict suit, would ruin his evening just by being there. "Joshua, I ordered dinner and I'm going to eat it," I said calmly. "You can go back to your friends." "But you don't understand." He leaned toward me, lowering his voice to a desperate whisper. "Chloe Preston is there, and her father is one of the most influential people in town. If she sees me here with some—" He faltered, not daring to finish. "With some old woman?" I suggested coldly. Joshua's face reddened, but he didn't deny it. "Grandma, please," he continued to plead. "You yourself said that we should help our family. Help me now. Just leave." At that moment, Melissa approached the table with a plate of tiramisu, which I hadn't had time to order, but which Thomas had obviously sent me. "Your dessert, ma'am," she smiled. "From the chef, with best wishes." "Thank you," I replied and picked up a spoon. Joshua looked at me with growing desperation. "Grandma, can you hear me? I need you to leave. And I need to finish my dinner," I replied calmly, tasting the tiramisu. "But you don't understand how important this is to me." Joshua's voice grew louder and more desperate. I've been preparing for this evening for a month, telling them about myself. If they find out that I have such a— What? I asked, continuing to eat my dessert. That I have a grandmother, he finally blurted out. An old woman who goes to cheap restaurants and— Cheap? I asked with interest. Well, not cheap, but— Joshua got tangled up in his own words. Grandma, please don't be selfish. Think about me for once in your life. Several patrons at neighboring tables began to turn around, drawn by his raised voice. I saw Joshua's friends also looking in our direction with curiosity and slight concern. Joshua, you're attracting attention, I said quietly. Go back to your friends. No. He slammed his fist on the table, making the glasses rattle. You don't understand. Chloe is the most popular girl in our class. Her family, they can open any door for me. And you're ruining everything. The conversations at the neighboring tables fell silent. Everyone was looking at us. I could feel the tension mounting, but I continued to eat my tiramisu calmly. Joshua, I said very quietly, you're behaving inappropriately. And you're being selfish, he shouted, finally losing control. No, you're going to embarrass me in this restaurant. I can't allow. His words were interrupted by a familiar voice. Good evening, Ms. Clark. We both turned around. Thomas was standing next to our table, his face expressing polite concern. He had obviously heard the raised voices and had come to investigate the situation. Good evening, Thomas, I replied calmly. I apologize for the disturbance, he continued, ignoring Joshua, who had turned pale. If you are dissatisfied with the service, we can move you to our VIP room. Your table is ready. A dead silence fell. Joshua looked at Thomas, then at me, then back at Thomas. His face gradually changed color from pale to red and back again. What? What did you say? He muttered. I suggested that Mrs. Clark move to the VIP room, Thomas repeated, now with slight confusion. We always try to provide our special guests with maximum comfort. Special guests? Joshua's voice became hoarse. Absolutely. Thomas looked at my grandson with growing surprise. Mrs. Clark is the owner of our restaurant. We always— He didn't finish. Joshua sat down abruptly on the nearest chair, as if his legs had given way. His face turned waxy pale, and his eyes became completely glassy. The owner? He repeated barely audibly. The room became so quiet that you could hear the wall clock ticking. All the visitors watched our scene with undisguised interest, and at a large table against the opposite wall, 5 young people sat with their mouths open, clearly hearing every word of the conversation. A dark-haired girl was watching particularly intently, the very Chloe Preston my grandson was so desperate to impress. The silence in the restaurant was so complete that it seemed even the air conditioners had stopped working. All eyes were fixed on our table, where my grandson sat with the expression of a man who had just learned that the end of the world was nigh. Thomas stood nearby, still not understanding what was going on, while I calmly finished my tiramisu as if nothing unusual had happened. Chloe Preston was the first to break the silence. She got up from the far table and slowly made her way toward us, her high heels clicking melodiously on the parquet floor. The rest of the group also got up, as if drawn by a magnet to the unfolding drama. Joshua, Chloe said as she approached, won't you introduce us to your grandmother? Her voice was soft and polite, but I detected a note of steely curiosity in it. This girl was clearly no fool. Behind her impeccable appearance and social graces lay a sharp mind and an ability to quickly analyze a situation. Joshua opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He just sat there, looking at me and then at Chloe, as if trying to find a way to turn the last 5 minutes into a bad dream. Allow me to introduce myself, I said, extending my hand to the girl. Vivian Clark. Chloe shook my hand gracefully, and I felt a surprisingly firm handshake. Chloe Preston, she replied. It's very nice to meet you, Mrs. Clark. Josh has told me so much about his family. The last phrase was delivered with a hint of irony that was noticed not only by me, but also by the rest of the group, who had gathered around our table by then. I hope only good things, I replied with a smile. Oh, yes, definitely. Chloe nodded, glancing quickly at Joshua, who was still silent. He said that his family, how should I put it, lives very modestly, that you, in particular, are experiencing some financial difficulties. The air around our table seemed to thicken. I saw Thomas frown slightly, trying to understand where the conversation was going. The other young people exchanged glances, sensing the growing tension. Financial difficulties? I asked with genuine surprise. That's interesting. Yes, Chloe continued, keeping her eyes fixed on me. Josh said that you live on a single pension and that the family is considering the possibility of, what's it called? More economical housing for the elderly. Joshua finally found his voice. Chloe, you shouldn't, he began hoarsely. Why shouldn't I? The girl interrupted him. I think it's very noble of you to take care of your grandmother. Although now that I know Mrs. Clark owns one of the best restaurants in town, I'm a little confused. The blond guy Roberto called Mr. Preston, obviously Chloe's brother or cousin, stepped closer. Excuse me, but are you really the owner of this place? He asked bluntly. Yes, I replied simply. Damn, one of the guys exhaled. But Josh said you came from a poor family. I didn't say we were poor, Joshua finally exploded. I said we had certain difficulties. What kind of difficulties? Chloe asked sweetly. Too many restaurants or too much profit? Several patrons at neighboring tables struggled to contain their laughter. The situation was becoming increasingly absurd, and I was beginning to enjoy it. Chloe, please, Joshua pleaded. You don't understand. Grandma, she's not exactly, technically she's the owner, but in reality, what? I asked coldly. My grandson fell silent, realizing he was digging himself into an even deeper hole. But Chloe wasn't going to let him off the hook. Josh, I think you're confusing something, she said, turning her whole body toward him. 2 weeks ago, when we were talking about plans for the evening, you said that your grandmother was a poor, lonely old woman who was barely making ends meet, that your family was considering a nursing home because they could no longer support her. I didn't quite say that, Joshua muttered, blushing even more. How exactly did you say it? Another guy from their group, a thin brunette with glasses, joined the conversation. Because I remember that story too. You complained that your family was spending all their money on maintaining the old house and on your grandmother, and that you have to skimp on everything, added the only blonde in the group. So you can't afford expensive restaurants and entertainment. I felt a cold wave of anger rising inside me. So my grandson was not only ashamed of me, but also used my supposed poverty as an excuse for his own stinginess. Joshua, I said quietly, but loud enough for everyone around to hear, is this true? Did you tell your friends that I'm a burden on the family? No, not exactly. He glanced around, looking for support, but his friends' faces expressed only confusion and disappointment. So what exactly is true? I insisted. Grandma, you don't understand, Joshua began desperately. I didn't mean to. I thought I needed to explain why I couldn't spend as much money as they did. Oh, I see, Chloe said slowly. You used your grandmother as an excuse for greed. It's not greed, Joshua protested. It's sensible saving. I don't have as much money as you do. But your grandmother does, noted blonde-haired Preston, who apparently owns more than one restaurant. Thomas, who had been listening silently all this time, finally decided to intervene. "Excuse me for interrupting," he said politely, "but Mrs. Clark owns 3 establishments in the city. Olive Garden is just one of them. If Joshua could have turned any paler, he would have." Chloe raised an eyebrow with the expression of someone who had just received interesting information. "3 restaurants," she repeated slowly. "Josh, did you know about this?" "I, no. I mean, I wasn't sure," my grandson stammered. "How can you not be sure what your own grandmother does?" the blonde asked with undisguised surprise. "We're not very close," Joshua said quickly. "I mean, we see each other, but not often, and Grandma doesn't talk about her business." "Doesn't talk about it, or don't you ask?" Chloe asked coldly. Joshua opened his mouth but couldn't find anything to say. An awkward pause ensued, which was broken by the guy with glasses. "Listen, Josh," he said thoughtfully. "Remember how you refused to go with us to La Scala last month? You said it was too expensive, that your family couldn't afford it. And you never pay for shared bills," added the blonde. "You always say you're short on cash. And when we asked you to come with us to Las Vegas for vacation, you said you were having a financial crisis at home," recalled the blonde-haired Preston. Chloe nodded slowly, putting the pieces of the puzzle together in her head. "I see," she finally said. "So you've been lying to us about your financial situation all this time." "I wasn't lying," Joshua protested desperately. "I really can't spend that much money." "Why?" Chloe asked bluntly. "If your grandmother owns restaurants, what's the problem?" "Well, it's her money, not mine," Joshua muttered. "Ah," the girl said with understanding. "So you wanted us to think you were from a poor family that was barely making ends meet. So we would feel sorry for you and not expect you to spend lavishly." "That's not true." "How exactly?" The guy with glasses chimed in. "Because that's exactly how it looks." I watched the scene with growing interest. My grandson was caught in the trap of his own lies, and his friends were slowly but surely beginning to understand what kind of person they had been associating with. "Joshua," I said quietly, "do you want to explain something?" He looked at me with despair in his eyes. "Grandma, you understand. I couldn't tell them we had money because then they would expect that you would behave like a normal person and pay your share." Chloe interrupted him. "No, I mean, it's hard to explain." "Try," suggested blonde Preston, folding his arms across his chest. Joshua glanced between me and his friends, clearly realizing that anything he said would only make the situation worse. "Listen," he finally began. "Yes, my grandmother owns restaurants, but that doesn't mean I have access to that money. She, she's very frugal and doesn't give us." "Us?" I asked. "Well, my family, my parents, me." He paused, realizing he was saying too much again. Saying too much. "So you're angry at your grandmother for not giving you money?" Chloe clarified. "I'm not angry," Joshua exclaimed. "It's just, why should she live alone in a huge house and own restaurants when her family is in need?" There was complete silence. Even the waiters froze, not daring to approach our table. Everyone looked at Joshua with an expression that could only be described as shock. "Wow," the blonde finally exhaled. "So you think you're entitled to your grandmother's money just because you're her grandson?" "Families should help each other," Joshua defended himself. "And how do you help your grandmother?" asked the guy with glasses. My grandson fell silent, apparently unable to find an answer to this simple question. Chloe looked at me with renewed interest. "Mrs. Clark," she said respectfully, "it seems to me that we had incomplete information about the situation. Josh presented the case in a completely different light." "I noticed," I replied dryly. "And if I may ask, are you really considering moving into a nursing home?" My son and daughter-in-law think it would be wise, I replied. They think my house is too expensive to maintain for an elderly woman. Chloe nodded in understanding. And how do you feel about the idea? I prefer to live in my own home, I said simply. Of course, the girl agreed, and you obviously have every opportunity to do so. Joshua sat with his head down, clearly realizing that he had completely failed in the eyes of people whose opinion mattered to him. His carefully constructed image had collapsed in a matter of minutes, and now everyone could see him for who he really was. After the conversation with his friends had reached an impasse, Joshua sat silently for a while, staring at the table, as if hoping that the earth would open up and swallow him. Chloe and the rest of the group returned to their table, but the mood of their evening was hopelessly ruined. They spoke in hushed voices, glancing in our direction from time to time, and it was obvious that they were discussing the scene that had just taken place. Thomas tactfully withdrew, realizing that family drama required privacy, but I could see him watching the situation from a distance, ready to intervene if necessary. Several waiters also kept their distance, not daring to approach our table, even though my glass had long been empty, and Joshua's plate of uneaten tiramisu stood before him like a silent reproach. Finally, my grandson looked up at me with eyes red with shame. They showed confusion, hurt, and something like remorse, although I wasn't sure how sincere the latter was. Joshua always knew how to portray the right emotions when the situation demanded it. Grandma, he began quietly, looking around to make sure no one at the neighboring tables could hear him. Can I sit down? I nodded, pointing to the chair opposite him. Joshua sat down uncertainly, still avoiding my gaze. His hands fidgeted nervously with the napkin, and his breathing was uneven. Clearly, what had happened had shaken him much more than he was willing to admit. I wanted to apologize, he finally said, still looking away. For what happened? For yelling at you. For yelling? I asked calmly. Or for what I said? Joshua grimaced as if my words had caused him physical pain. For everything, he muttered. I didn't mean to. I didn't think it would turn out like this. What exactly didn't you think? I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. That I'd find out about your stories to your friends, or that I'd run into you here. I didn't know you owned this restaurant, he said, finally looking up at me. Honestly, we never talked about your business. Because you're not interested, I stated. You're only interested in things that directly concern you. Joshua blushed but didn't argue. Somewhere deep down, he knew my words were true, although admitting it out loud was beyond his power. Grandma, he continued, lowering his voice to a whisper, you understand why I couldn't tell them the truth, right? They all come from wealthy families and have everything they want. And I have, you have me, I interrupted, a grandmother who owns 3 restaurants. But you chose to present me as a burden. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean when you told them I was barely making ends meet? I asked, leaning closer. What did you mean when you said the family spends all its money on me? Joshua cringed in his chair, as if trying to make himself smaller. The confidence and arrogance he had displayed during the family dinner had completely disappeared, leaving only confusion and shame. I just didn't want them to think I was greedy, he finally admitted. When they suggest going somewhere expensive or to an expensive restaurant, and I refuse, I needed an explanation. And you decided that the best explanation was to paint your family in an unflattering light? No, he shook his head. I didn't think it would hurt anyone. You wouldn't find out about it. I felt a new wave of cold anger rising inside me. So, the only thing that mattered to him was that no one in his family found out about his lie. He didn't think at all about how this lie might affect our relationship or my reputation. Joshua, I said very quietly, yesterday at the dinner table, you said that I was behind the times, that normal old people live in special places. Remember? He nodded without looking up. And today, you tell me that you introduced me to your friends as a poor old woman living on a single pension. Do you see the connection? What connection? In both cases, you are using my age and my situation to achieve your goals. I explained patiently. Yesterday, my age was an argument in favor of selling the house, because that's what your parents wanted. Today, my supposedly dire situation became an excuse for your stinginess, because that's what you wanted. Joshua looked up at me, his eyes reflecting confusion and something like understanding. I didn't think about it that way, he muttered. Of course you didn't. You don't think about anyone but yourself. Those words came out harsher than I intended, but they were true, and we both knew it. Joshua cringed even more, but he didn't argue. You know what strikes me the most? I continued. Not that you lied to your friends, not that you're ashamed of your family. It's that you still don't understand what you did wrong. I understand, he said quietly. I shouldn't have lied. That's only part of the problem, I shook my head. The main problem is how you treat people, your family, your friends, me. How, exactly? As a means to an end. You need your parents to pay for college. You need me as an object of pity or a source of money. You need your friends for connections and entertainment. You don't see people as individuals. You only see what they can give you. Joshua was silent, digesting my words. At Chloe's table, the conversation died down. They were clearly listening to our conversation, making no attempt to hide their curiosity. Yesterday at lunch, I continued, you agreed with your parents when they talked about nursing homes. You said it was normal to send old people to special places. What do you think about that now? I, he faltered, obviously realizing that any answer would be wrong. You thought I was a frail old woman without a penny to my name, I said for him, and you were fine with that. What's more, you used it to your advantage. Now it turns out I'm not helpless, and you don't know how to behave. That's not true, he protested weakly. No? I leaned forward. Then explain to me what has changed in your attitude toward me in the last hour, other than what you've learned about restaurants. Joshua opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. He knew I was right, but admitting it would mean admitting the ugliness of his behavior. Grandma, he finally said, I realize I was wrong, but I didn't know. What exactly didn't you know? I interrupted. That I have money? And does that change anything? If I really had nothing but my pension, would my desire to live in my own home be any less legitimate? He fell silent again, clearly not knowing how to respond. Joshua, I said quietly, the problem isn't that you didn't know about the restaurants. The problem is that, whether you knew or not, you thought it was okay to use me for your own needs. And you still think that someone at Chloe's table laughed softly, and Joshua turned sharply in that direction, his face contorted with shame and anger. He realized he had become the object of ridicule of those whose opinions were so important to him. They're laughing at me, he muttered. So what? I asked. You deserve to be laughed at. Grandma, he turned back to me, his eyes pleading. Can't you say something to them? Explain that it's not so bad? I looked at him in amazement. What exactly should I explain to them? That you're a good boy who just made a little mistake? Well, yes, something like that. Joshua, I said very slowly, are you asking me to lie to your friends to restore your reputation? He blushed but nodded. After everything that's happened, after you publicly humiliated me and made me look like a burden, you want me to help you get out of an unpleasant situation? We're family, he said desperately. Families help each other. I leaned back in my chair and looked at my grandson for a long time. A 19-year-old young man, a student at a prestigious university, who had never learned the basic concepts of decency and respect. Even now, after everything that had happened, he was only thinking about how to save face. Families help each other. I repeated his words. Interesting. When was the last time you helped your family, Joshua? He opened his mouth but again couldn't find an answer. When was the last time you took an interest in my affairs, my health, my plans? I continued. When was the last time you came to me just to talk, not because your parents made you? I I have school, a lot of things to do. Everyone has a lot to do. I snapped. That's no excuse. Joshua sat with his head down, and I could see tears running down his cheeks. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he was facing the consequences of his selfishness and didn't know how to deal with them. What should I do now? He asked quietly. Grow up, I replied simply. Learn to think about more than just yourself. Learn to respect other people, and start taking responsibility for your words and actions. He nodded without looking up. Now go back to your friends, I added, and try to spend the rest of the evening with dignity. Joshua slowly got up from my table and hesitantly headed back to his friends. I saw his shoulders trembling, his steps uncertain. The conversation with me had clearly affected him more than he had expected. His friends watched their former friend approach with an expression that could be described as a mixture of curiosity and cold condemnation. When Joshua sat down, an awkward silence hung in the air. No one knew how to continue the evening after what had happened. Chloe leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and looked at him as if she were seeing him for the first time in her life. Light-haired Preston drummed his fingers on the table. The blonde studied her manicure, and the guy with glasses openly examined Joshua with scientific interest. Well, Josh, Chloe finally broke the silence, will you tell us something else interesting about your family? Maybe your grandfather owned a chain of hotels? Or do you have a millionaire uncle you forgot to mention? Joshua grimaced at the sarcasm in her voice. Chloe, please, he muttered. I already apologized. You didn't apologize to me, she remarked coldly. You apologized to your grandmother, whom you tried to portray in a humiliating light. I wasn't trying to humiliate her, Joshua protested. I was just— What exactly were you doing? Interrupted the guy with glasses, leaning forward, because from the outside it looked exactly like humiliation. You used the story of a poor old woman to justify your own stinginess. The blonde nodded in agreement. And it was so disgusting, Josh, to portray your grandmother as a burden just so you wouldn't have to pay for dinner. I didn't portray her as a burden. Joshua raised his voice, attracting the attention of the neighboring tables. I was just explaining the family situation. What situation? Asked the blonde-haired Preston. The one where your grandmother owns 3 restaurants and you're still stingy about every dinner. It's not her money, Joshua blurted out. I mean, technically yes, but she doesn't give it to the family. Chloe raised an eyebrow. So what? It's her money. She can do whatever she wants with it. Or do you think you have some kind of right to your grandmother's fortune? Families should help each other. Joshua stubbornly repeated the phrase I had already heard twice that evening. Help, the blonde agreed. And how do you help your grandmother, other than telling everyone how pathetic she is? Joshua opened his mouth, but couldn't find anything to say. His face reddened again with shame and anger. I watched the scene without interfering in the conversation. I was curious to see how my grandson would behave when cornered by people his own age. Would he deal with his pride or try to shift the blame onto others? Listen, Joshua finally said, lowering his voice. I understand that things didn't go well today, but we're friends, right? We can talk about it and forget about it. Friends? Chloe asked in surprise. Josh, real friends don't lie to each other for months, and they certainly don't use stories about sick relatives for their own benefit. My grandmother isn't sick, Joshua protested. No, but that's how you portrayed her, the guy with glasses reminded him. A frail old woman on a pension who can barely make ends meet. Remember that story? I didn't say she was frail. How else can we understand your stories about what your family thinks about nursing homes? The blonde chimed in. You said outright that she can no longer live on her own. Joshua fell silent, realizing that every word he uttered only made the situation worse. Chloe studied his face intently, as if trying to figure out what was hidden behind the mask of remorse. You know what strikes me the most, Josh? She finally said. Not that you lied. People lie for all kinds of reasons, but how easily you used the image of a defenseless old woman to manipulate us. It's not manipulation, Joshua snapped. Then what is it? Asked the blonde-haired Preston. You told us a touching story about a poor grandmother so that we would feel sorry for you and not expect generosity. If that's not manipulation, then what is? I just wanted you to understand me. Understand what exactly? Chloe interrupted. That you're greedy? We would have understood that without any stories about your grandmother. Several people at neighboring tables chuckled quietly when they heard this exchange. Joshua blushed even more and clenched his fists under the table. Very funny, he muttered. I think it's really funny, agreed the guy with glasses. A guy from a family of restaurant tycoons is pretending to be poor so he doesn't have to pay for pizza. We're not tycoons, Joshua protested. 3 restaurants in San Jose is quite a serious business, the blonde woman remarked, especially judging by how they treat your grandmother here. Everyone looked in my direction. I was just paying the waitress who had served me with particular care. Thomas appeared out of nowhere and gallantly helped me up from the table. See, the blonde continued, the owners are treated very differently here, and you told us that you'd never been to such expensive places. I haven't, Joshua insisted. I mean, not as a customer. I didn't know that my grandmother— You didn't know anything about your grandmother? Chloe interrupted sharply. Because you didn't care. All you cared about was how to use her in your stories. That's not true. No? Chloe leaned closer. Then tell me, Josh, when was the last time you visited your grandmother just because? Not for a family dinner, but on your own initiative? Joshua hesitated, obviously trying to remember such an occasion. I I have my studies. I understand, Chloe remarked dryly. And when was the last time you asked about her life, her health, her plans? Older people don't like to talk about their problems. She doesn't talk about her problems, interrupted the guy with glasses. She talks about her successes. She has a thriving business, and you had no idea. Because she's secretive, or because you never asked, suggested the blonde. The blonde-haired Preston shook his head in disgust. You know, Josh, I thought I knew you. We've been studying together for 2 years, and I thought you were a normal guy. A little stingy, but generally decent. I am decent? Decent people don't lie about their families, Preston objected. And they certainly don't use elderly relatives as a tool for manipulation. And decent people don't yell at their grandmothers in public places, Chloe added, especially grandmothers who support them. She doesn't support me, Joshua snapped. Who pays for your education? The blonde asked. My parents. And who supports your parents? She continued. Judging by what you've said, they can barely make ends meet. Joshua fell silent again, realizing he had fallen into another trap. If his family was really poor, where did the money for the expensive university come from? If his family was well off, why did he lie about being poor? It's complicated, he finally muttered. No, Josh, Chloe shook her head. It's very simple. You lied to us because you wanted to appear better than you really are. You wanted us to feel sorry for you and not expect generosity from you. And in doing so, you humiliated your grandmother, who, it turns out, is a successful businesswoman, added the guy with glasses. You portrayed her as a burden that the family wants to get rid of. That's what she thinks, Joshua protested desperately. Yesterday at dinner, she said. What exactly did she say? Chloe asked coldly. Joshua faltered, realizing he had said too much again. It doesn't matter, he muttered. It matters a lot, Chloe insisted. Tell us what your grandmother said at the family dinner. We were discussing her future. Did you discuss it, or did you dictate it to her? Clarified the blonde-haired Preston. Joshua blushed and turned away toward the window. His silence spoke louder than any words. I see, Chloe nodded. So the family council decided what to do with the inconvenient old woman. And then you came to us and told us how pathetic and helpless she was. Enough, Joshua exploded. You don't understand anything. You all have rich parents. You don't have to think about money. But we have to think about decency, the blonde replied calmly, and how we treat our loved ones. And we also need to think about who we befriend, added Chloe, getting up from the table. I'm sorry, Josh, but I don't want to spend the evening in the company of someone who lies about their loved ones. She picked up her purse and headed for the exit. The rest of the group exchanged glances, and one by one also got up from the table. The blonde-haired Preston threw a few bills on the table. This will cover your share of the bill, he said to Joshua. We don't want your poor family to pay for our dinner. The guy with glasses shook his head. You know, Josh, I feel sorry for your grandmother. Having a grandson like you must be a real punishment. They left, leaving Joshua alone at the large table. He sat staring at his plate, and I could see his shoulders shaking. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he was facing the real consequences of his behavior. I finished my water and got up from my table. It was time to leave. The evening was coming to an end, and I had nothing more to do here. I got up from the table, feeling the eyes of the few other patrons who had become unwitting witnesses to the family drama. The atmosphere in the restaurant gradually returned to its usual tranquility. The waiters delicately cleared the tables. Jazz music played softly, and candles cast soft reflections on the polished surfaces. Only one table in the middle of the room disrupted this harmony. My grandson sat there all alone, staring at his half-eaten plate. Thomas materialized next to me, as always appearing just when I needed him. Mrs. Clark, I hope that despite the unpleasant situation, your evening wasn't completely ruined, he asked quietly, glancing cautiously at Joshua. The evening was very informative, I replied, putting on my jacket. Thank you for the excellent service and for allowing me to see the restaurant through the eyes of a regular customer. Always at your service. I hope tomorrow's meeting will take place in a more relaxed atmosphere. Definitely. I need to discuss some changes with you. Thomas nodded without asking any unnecessary questions. Over the years, he had learned to understand my moods and never asked questions when he saw that I needed privacy. I headed for the exit, passing Joshua's table. He looked up as I walked by, and our eyes met for a moment. In his eyes, I saw confusion, shame, and something like a plea for forgiveness. But forgiveness must be earned, not begged for with pitiful looks. Grandma, he called softly as I was almost at the door. I stopped but didn't turn around. How am I supposed to get home now? Chloe was driving. Call a taxi, I replied without turning around. Or take the bus. The stop is 2 blocks from here. But I don't have money for a taxi? Then take the bus, or walk. It's only 20 kilometers. I walked out onto the street, leaving him to ponder his transportation options. The evening air was fresh and cool, with a faint scent of jasmine from the neighboring garden. The city was gradually falling asleep. Most of the shops were already closed. Restaurants were preparing to close for the day, and only a few bars continued to glow with dim lights. I got into my car and sat silently for a while, thinking about what had happened. The evening had given me a lot to think about, and not all of it was pleasant. My grandson, whom I once held in my arms, had turned into a selfish and deceitful young man, a man capable of using his grandmother as a tool to achieve his own goals. But the saddest thing was not even that. The saddest thing was that Joshua was not alone in his attitude toward me. His behavior was merely a reflection of what he had seen at home, what his own family had taught him. Roger and Cynthia had spent years showing him that older relatives were a burden that needed to be dealt with, and he had learned that lesson all too well. I started the engine and slowly drove out onto the deserted street. On the way home, I thought about how radically my life had changed in the last 24 hours. Yesterday morning, I was just a lonely widow whom my own family considered a burden. Tonight, I witnessed my grandson publicly humiliate me, unaware of my true capabilities. This situation became a test for me, a test of who is who in my life, who can truly be considered family, and who simply bears the Clark name by mistake. When I got home, I sat in my car in the driveway for a while, looking at my house. The big, beautiful house that Roger and Cynthia so wanted to sell. The house where I spent the best years of my life, where every room held memories of happy times with Arthur. A house that the family considered too expensive for a lonely old woman. But I was neither lonely nor helpless. I had a successful business, enough money to live comfortably, and a clear mind to make important decisions. And I made one of those decisions tonight, watching my grandson's behavior. Upon entering the house, I went to Arthur's study, which had remained untouched all these years. His desk stood there, framed family photos hung on the walls, and his favorite books lay scattered about. In one of the desk drawers was a safe containing important documents, including my will. I took out the will and read it carefully. The document had been drawn up 3 years ago, shortly after Arthur's death, when grief still clouded my judgment and family ties seemed sacred and unbreakable. According to this will, all my property, the house, restaurants, savings, went to Roger, and in the event of his death, to Joshua. Now, sitting at my late husband's desk, surrounded by his belongings, I realized how naive I had been 3 years ago. I had drawn up the will based on my ideas of family obligations and blood ties. It seemed obvious to me that my inheritance should go to my son and grandson, but a lot has changed in those 3 years. Or rather, a lot has been revealed. My family's attitude toward me has been laid bare, especially after yesterday's lunch and today's scene at the restaurant. Roger and Cynthia saw me as a source of money to solve their own financial problems. Joshua considered me a convenient subject for his pitiful stories. None of them were interested in me as a person. No one appreciated my achievements, respected my choices, or took my wishes into account. To them, I was just an old woman who had lived too long and clung too stubbornly to her attachments. I folded up the will and put it back in the safe. Tomorrow, I will contact a lawyer to draw up a new document. Roger and Joshua will receive symbolic sums, enough not to contest the will in court, but not enough to live a life of luxury. The bulk of my estate will go to charity and to people who truly deserve support. Thomas, for example, will receive enough money to open his own restaurant. He has worked honestly all these years and deserves his independence. We will establish several scholarships for talented but poor students, unlike Joshua, who got everything simply by right of birth. Part of the money will go to a fund to help elderly people whose families are trying to force them into nursing homes. Thinking about this, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was as if a heavy burden of false obligations and contrived family responsibilities had been lifted from my shoulders. I no longer owed anyone anything just because we shared the same last name. Family is not only chosen by blood ties. Family is those people who accept you for who you are, respect your choices, and cherish your presence in their lives. By these criteria, Thomas was closer to me than Roger, and the waitress Melissa showed me more sincere concern than Joshua had in all the years. I got up from my chair and walked to the window, from where I could see the entire courtyard and part of the street. Somewhere out there in the city, my grandson was probably still sitting in the restaurant, wondering how to get home and how to explain the failure of the evening to his parents. I should have felt sorry for him, but instead of pity, I felt only cold indifference. Joshua got exactly what he deserved. His lie was exposed at the worst possible moment, in front of the people whose opinion mattered most to him. He lost face in front of his friends and was left alone to deal with the consequences of his behavior. Maybe it will be a lesson for him, or maybe he'll just find new people to lie to. In any case, it's no longer my problem. Tomorrow I will start a new life, a life in which there will be no place for false family obligations and selfish relatives, a life where I can be myself without apologizing for my achievements and without justifying my desire to live in my own home. Roger, Cynthia, and Joshua will learn of their new status when the will is read. Until then, let them continue to make plans for me and consider me a burden. They're in for a surprise.